what we have to think about is, what have the Romans ever done for us as such? Yeah, what did the British ever do for India? This topic is very, very divisive. If you see this online, like, Indians were not very pleased with obviously being ruled for like 100 years or so. No country wants to be ruled by another, so obviously people are gonna feel a certain type of way about it and stuff. I'm certainly not a cheerleader for the empire. Like, kind of watch my other videos about it. I don't think it makes any level of sense to say that you're a liberal empire. That's a contradiction term. That's an oxymoron. You know, as I said in previous videos, so check those out. I think that Britain would have been better if it never had an empire. But we're going to look at like the impact that Britain did have in India. So first of all, you know, they did build some things. You know, they did do some things that were good. They did build for instance, the largest irrigation system in the whole world at that point, and that obviously improved the lives of many, many people. They also did build the railroads, which obviously India is now famous for. At the same time, everything we kind of say, we have to kind of say with a caveat, yeah, because all these things which were done for India weren't done for benevolent reasons. As we said before, the British Empire's whole thing was making money, making it easy for British businesses and British like people to operate in these countries. So the railways were not built for the benefit of regular Indian people. It was built so that the colonial administrators could obviously get from A to B, and also for the resources and stuff like of India to get to the ports and then to be shipped to Britain. And also as well, like, kind of it meant that obviously the personnel and like a lot of the experts who were part of that system, a lot of the engineers, Indians were kind of like kept out of a lot of these things, and so it's quite difficult for Indian companies, for Indian like kind of professionals, yeah, to want to be able to actually work in these sectors. Again, it wasn't this kind of benevolent thing like, oh, let's just build railways for people and stuff. It was tied in with this wider reason for having an empire. If we look at how India grew under the British Empire, from 1850 to 1947, India's GDP grew by 70%. So that averages 0.55% per annum. That's not great. That's pretty much stagnant growth over a period of like almost 100 years. However, what we have to kind of bear in mind is this, yeah, right? How was India governed beforehand? Within the period between 1700 and 1850, Indian GDP grew by an average of about 0.22%. That's not great. That's 39% over a period of 150 years. And you say, well, you know, the East India Company was there, so, and they stole a lot of the land then, and you know, they were exploitive, etc. etc. Okay, cool. How about the period from 1600 to 1700, where it was basically run by the Mughals and other kind of like princely states? Yeah, it grew by 0.2%. Most societies around the world, most cultures around the world, didn't see whole level of growth, like economic growth. This modern notion we have of like things always getting better, of technology always improving, standard of living always rising, yeah, it's a concept which is about 250 years old, and it coincides with the Industrial Revolution. Before the Agricultural Revolution, which then led to the Industrial Revolution, that wasn't a thing like anywhere in the world. Like, people were born poor and you died poor. People didn't suddenly become like super like wealthy and stuff. There wasn't this kind of entrepreneurial spirit. People weren't like looking, they weren't economists. They're going like, oh, the GDP has gone up by 2%. That just wasn't a thing. Like, it was stagnant, right? If you look at the period between 1850 to 1947, the GDP per capita in India rose from $533 in 1990 international dollars terms. So 533, I'm really messing up my numbers now. 533 to 618. So that's almost negligible. That's a tiny jump, yeah. Like, that's almost no growth at all. However, obviously, so people kind of point now and say, oh, India's growing at a rapid pace, and this shows that like India like was better, obviously being run by the Indians. But again, most of that growth has been in the last like 30 years, when India has liberalized its economy and has actually opened itself up for international trade, because the standard thing for India has kind of just been stagnant growth for many centuries, if not like at least many centuries. So people often point to the fact that in 1870 India made up 16% of the world GDP, and by 1947 it was at just 4%. So people often point to that and go, see, the British stole lots of wealth, not recognizing that like the pie expands. As we said before, economics is not a zero-sum thing. It's not about slices of pizza being stolen by one person so that someone else can't have. It doesn't mean like the economy economy grows, and this is something known as the Great Divergence. Western capitalist industrialized nations suddenly shot up and far exceeded all the rest of the world. That's the main reason. It's called the Great Divergence because all other countries in the world, all other civilizations, just continue to stagnate, whereas Western Europe and its offshoots just suddenly went boom. And as a result of that, that's why Britain, a tiny little island of 47 million people, was able to outcompete India, which had, almost like 300 million people. It's because of this innovation, because of this new technology, because of this industrialization. Does this mean that the Indians were just lazy or something? No, it doesn't mean that. The British had a lot of control over what things the Indians can do. So the British bought things off the Indians for cheap, but and sold it to their market. But the Indian companies weren't able to sell to Britain because they had heavy levels of taxes put on them, etc., etc. So there was a lot of restrictive practices. At the same time, the British often used the same tax policies that the local administrators had themselves. The local princely states, the local rulers within India, they also had many of these practices beforehand. The Mughals had these practices beforehand. The British kind of just did a continuation of what had already been in place. Maybe they might have put a few more restrictions, but realistically, it wasn't that much. Actually, an interesting story I found when I was doing research for this is the story of Tata Steel. So everyone knows about Tata Steel. Well, not everyone knows, but the people who know about this stuff. Tata Steel is a very famous Indian steel making company. But how they got started was the father of it. I'm gonna butcher his name. Jamsetji Tata. Yeah, right. So he was involved in the textile industry. Yeah. So obviously getting cotton and turning it into clothes and different fabrics and cloths and stuff. However, the British says no, we don't need that. We need heavy industry. So because of that, he kind of ended up having to get into the steel industry, and because of that, Tata Steel is now so large that actually a few years ago there's a steel production plant somewhere in, I believe, Wales, and actually it was bought out by Tata Steel. The tables have turned in a weird way. So it's now Indian companies are buying up former British companies and making a profit out of them. So it's interesting how things turn. But I think that this this argument that India was held down by the British, and it would have suddenly become this booming behemoth if it weren't for British rule. The data doesn't seem to bear that out. Yes, maybe if they had adopted the right practices, but regardless of who's running you, if the people running you are not doing smart economic policies, then your economy is going to stagnate no matter what. Whether the British rule you or you rule you, if people are not putting in these market-friendly policies, your economy is not going to grow.